Enjoy, everybody.
Cool, cool. How's it, everyone? Thanks, Iggy. So, as mentioned, my name is Makaziwe. And apart from being an avid avocado hater by night, by day, I'm actually a product designer, agile coach and trainer for KMC, Chabane Majestic Consulting for the full name. And basically, what we do is we're an innovation digital consultancy with agile really at our core, and that's really what we do. And today, and just a little bit about my role and my experience. So, as being a product designer, so my role is sort of like end to end. So, I have both experience in both the design world and the development world. So, I sort of like have experience in both sides of the fence, if you will. And anyone who's actually ever been in a delivery team with any designer or developers know that there's this silent and cold war that happens between these two worlds. Many know about it, many have seen it, sometimes many don't even say anything about it. So this is what this talk is about. So design and dev, and basically using design thinking as a tool to possibly bridge this gap and fix things, and fix this war, right? So just a few disclaimers before I begin this talk. The first disclaimer is that even though this topic is relevant for both designers and devs, I will be speaking mainly towards the designers who are in this virtual room. But that doesn't mean you be disengaged if you're a dev or anyone else, because I guarantee you these sort of like points are poignant for anyone in an agile delivery team. Also, while I mentioned Agile, is a lot of the concepts that I'll be discussing can harken back and link with Agile, but you don't necessarily have to be in an Agile delivery team or even necessarily even believe in Agile to sort of like use some of these concepts that I'm going to be speaking about today. And the third thing, last thing, is really nothing about this topic is new. Absolutely nothing. Everyone knows that there's this cold and silent war that's happening. And I mean, there's countless articles if you just do a Google search of design versus devs. So there's nothing new under the sun that I'll be bringing here. Basically, what I'm trying to do is sort of like get us to think in a different sort of way in how to sort of like mend these gaps and bridge these rough storms, right? So cool. Let's get into it. So in today's world, instead of our interactions between design and dev being sort of like this utopia and happily married family in union, it often really looks more like this, right? A video street fighting game, whether it's a Street Fighter or I saw someone mentioning Mortal Kombat or anything. This is what it feels like with two clearly opposed camps who are ready to go at it and go to war, right? And let's just go through some of the scenarios that we might see and things that we might hear from each camp and each side. So in the red corner, we've got Mr. Mr. Dev over here. What you are most likely to hear from Mr. Dev and his goons is things like perfectionists. These designers are absolute perfectionists. Whatever they design, it takes way too long, and it's really frustrating that these like the designs they not only take too long, but they actually change way too frequently. Not knowing that actually there's method in the madness. Maybe there's some research that's been done which necessitates a change for the design, etc., etc. You might hear Mr. Sir Devolot also saying, what you actually designed is way too complex, dude. We don't have the time to do this. Can't you give us something a little bit way simpler than what you gave us? This is way too much. We can't do it. And sort of like a third thing you might hear from the dev camp is, what? A new component? Why did you design a new component when we can easily reuse something that you've already done in the past? Surely this is a waste of time, and surely it's more efficient to reuse whatever we've done. Cool. So that's the dev side and some scenarios that you might hear and see, right? But surely our white corner over here, the design camp, surely they say some things which gets under the skin of the developers as well, right? And what you're most likely to hear is the designer taking a look at the developed product and asking, what is this? WTF? This looks like nothing that I gave to you, looks like nothing in the design that I handed over, or every single bit of the detail has been absolutely lost. It could be hyperbole, it could be exaggeration, but this is usually what you hear. Something else you're most likely to hear is, you're only showing me this now. Surely it's too late. It's too late. It's already been developed. It's ready to ship. It's ready to go into testing phase. You haven't left me enough time to actually fix what you have broken. And then a third scenario you might hear or listen on in is, you guys only care about the tech. You don't care about our users. You don't care about their issues. You don't care about their needs. All you are worried about is how you can best technically implement this solution, right? And what you find is sometimes is our group of designers will go into this lovely research phase where they take a prototype and even like a high fidelity design and actually do some usability testing, right? And then some feedback might come out of that, which necessitates some changes. And often, like in an agile environment, these changes are put into the backlog, never to be seen again, forgotten forever and ever. And this always gets under the skin of the designers, that you don't care about these issues that we raised X amount of months ago. All you care about is getting these things done. Sweet. So sort of like now set the scene and we know there's a problem, yeah? So what's the possible solution? I posit, personally, that, and I'm so glad that there's been other talks who've talked about design thinking, so I'm not completely out of my mind, but I do hope that I don't bore you speaking about something that's been spoken before. But I actually posit that we can use design thinking as a tool to actually sort of like help remedy these grievances and these tensions and this distrust between these two worlds. So let me read a quote from the Interaction Design Organization website. They describe design thinking as a design methodology that provides a solution-based approach to solving problems. It's useful in tackling complex problems that are ill-defined and unknown by understanding human needs, reframing the problem in human-centric ways. If you don't take anything out of that, the only thing you should probably focus your mind on is the fact that this is just a tool, number one, and it's a tool to solve problems. Number two. Number three, that it solves these problems by understanding human needs and deriving human-centered ways to solve these problems. Cool. So, so essentially, it's just a neutral tool that we can use. Design thinking is not really something that should be just about a product. Yeah. So let's get into it. So design thinking, as we know it, I know there's different variations out there, but I'll stick with this one, which I got from the Interaction Design Organization. Is that it has these 5 different phases where you empathize, you define, you ideate, you prototype, and you test, right? And often when you're Googling design thinking and you're talking about design thinking, people will attach this phrase to it, that we're trying to build the right thing and build the thing right, which I absolutely agree with. But what if the thing that we're actually trying to build, the thing we're trying to build right, is not actually a product, but it's actually the relationships between developers and designers? Surely design thinking, if it's a method and a tool to solve complex problems using human-centered ways, surely we should be able to use this to build relationships better, right? And this actually reminds me of last year's edition of this conference, actually. There was a very intriguing talk by Balisa Sibeko and Vincent Hoffman, where they weren't even talking about interfaces. They were talking about actually designing the experience of employment better. So designing the interactions between employees and the employers to be much better. And this is sort of like the same concept, right? So let's go into it, into the first phase, where sort of like we're talking about empathizing. And really, when we're talking about empathy, this allows the design thinkers to set aside their own assumptions about the world in order to gain insight into user needs and what they feeling, right? So the whole idea is, don't assume to know what a person thinks or feels or reacts to something. And also, the key thing is to always put yourself in someone else's shoes to understand their fears, their frustrations, their motivations, and needs. So how does this apply to sort of like our dev versus design war? So excuse me. So the first point really is to build trust. So in the first slide, I talked about like there's this silent war, and this silent war is really that it's underpinned by like a very like a very sly sort of like distrust for each other's professions and each other's professions impact on your work, right? There's a distrust, a suspicion, even fears and frustrations. So the first thing really is to sort of like break down that distrust and suspicion and try to build trust. If possible, sit together. I know like this is one of the key agile principles of co-location, where a team must actually be in the same location. And what does this help to do? It helps facilitates communication much better, right? I know in a post-COVID world, this might be absolutely changed, but if possible, please sit together, right? And also, before like even work begins, you, the designer, with your developer buddy, try as much as possible to show genuine interest in what the other does. Ask questions, right? That will help you sort of like empathize more with what they do. In Agile, we have one of the ceremonies called a retro. So in every retro, sort of like we look back at a sprint and reflect on what we could have done better. And one of the key sayings before each retro starts is that it doesn't matter what the outcome was, but we know as a team that we know and trust that everyone did the best that they could with the information that they had. And I think if we take that posture, it's a great first step into empathizing with someone else who does something different than you. Also, secondly, I think it's very key to speak the same language between you and your developer buddy. So what do we mean by speak the same language? So share knowledge about your domain, right? I think knowledge sharing is absolutely key. So the goal is to increase communication and minimize misunderstanding. So if you're a developer, how about you share some basic concepts about what you do? Share some basic concepts about CSS, for example, HTML, so that your designer buddy actually can, when they are designing, they have a greater sense of what's possible and what's not, and what takes time and what doesn't. And I'm in no way, please don't misunderstand me, I'm in no way advocating for designers to become developers, for designers to code. That's not what I'm advocating, and no way advocating for developers to become designers all of a sudden. I'm just saying that sharing like basic concept of what you do is a very good way to form that understanding between the two of you, and that empathy, and actually sort of like strengthening your design, knowing what the limitations are, right? Cool. And the next step of our design thinking process is the whole concept of defining, right? So in traditional design thinking, this define stage is basically you are defining what the problem is. What is it that you are trying to fix and remedy? The define stage will help the designer gather great ideas that will help them solve the problems, or at the very least, allow users to resolve issues themselves. Very key. So how does this apply to us in this silent war, right? So the first step really is the both of you, whether you're a designer or a dev, must have some sort of understanding of what the requirements are. Whether those requirements are coming from a product owner, whether they're coming from a business analyst, or even from the business itself, you must get an understanding of what the requirements of what you're building are. But I don't think that's enough, though. I think you should have a shared understanding of those requirements. So if possible, if at all possible, be sure that you and your developer friend be in the same room when these requirements are spoken about. So that way you have a shared understanding of what these requirements mean. And it's ideal that these things actually happen before the work actually starts, right? And don't take for granted what a square means to someone else and what a square means to someone else. Because you might find when you talk together about these requirements, some person B might be thinking a triangle and you thinking a circle while you guys are talking about a square. So talk about these requirements together and get a shared understanding, right? Also, it's very key when you're defining how you want to work is you must actually talk to each other. Talk before any work begins, actually talk to each other and define how you guys want to work, right? Maybe you might discuss things like pairing. So in our organization, we make use of extreme programming concept called pairing a lot, where it's a concept where two developers sit together, one being sort of like the driver and the other one being the navigator. And that helps with a lot of shared understanding and cross-pollination of information together, right? But it doesn't have to be just dev on dev pairing. It can be dev and designer pairing. So sit together and talk about it if at all it's possible. Talk about your dislikes, your likes, and your dislikes in terms of working. We also utilize something called desk checks, where sort of like a developer will develop a feature, and then once they are satisfied that they've met all the requirements, they basically put up their hands and call everyone around and sort of like do a mini showcase to everyone around. And the audience would be your designer, would be your QA, your BA, potentially even your PO. And that way really is just to make sure that we shorten that feedback loop. So talk about these things, talk about how you want to work. Also talk about your potential collaboration tools that you might want to use. Do you guys want to use Zeppelin? Do you want to use UXPin? Do you want to use Evercode for design handoff? Do you want to use Abstract for your design repo? And I mean, like, don't leave these things to assumption because it will hurt you down the line. Sweet. Let's talk about ideate. So in traditional design thinking, when we're talking about ideating, is the aim is to start generating ideas of how you could possibly solve the problem. So with that in mind, how does this apply to us, right? So the important thing here is, and when I say them, I'm specifically referring to developers. So I'm talking to you designers, and them is the developers. Involve them as early as humanly possible. And please get their consent. Please underline that. And I'll get back to the idea of consent shortly. So the idea is to share your design ideas as soon as possible. So whether it's like a paper sketch, quickly a quick sketch just to sort of like explain your thinking to your developer, and that way we find that if a developer sees something is not going to work or is going to be too difficult to implement, then at least you know that upfront before you spend an extensive amount of time doing very expensive high fidelity design. So the idea is to share your idea and actually get some feedback from the developer just to gauge the technical feasibility. And this is to avoid the situation we saw in one of the earlier slides, where a developer comes back and says, this is way too difficult and way too complex to do, right? And this whole idea of consent, do not design without the developer's consent. So, and this basically speaks to that. Do not start designing anything expensive before you get consent first and you've discussed it. Another issue about ideate together. But what happens when you ideate with another person is that they start seeing gaps in your thinking and you start seeing gaps in their thinking, right? And which causes debate. But debate is not a problem. At least constructive debate is not a problem. So I think that's something actually we should, as designers, and I think it's built into our DNA, right? That as designers, we are always showcasing our work, and people always have an opinion of our work just based on the visual and visceral aspect of our work. So show your work and actually have a healthy debate with your developer colleague. just to get another perspective. Maybe you might have missed something, right? And always remember, when there's a disagreement, it's not necessarily a disagreement, but it's always a negotiation. Yeah. So always try to find the middle ground between what this person is saying and what this other person is saying. But this also, right, it comes from the fact that there should be some trust built in. And that's the whole idea of empathizing first before you get to this process. I like what Gordon, I think it's Gordon Angus, I apologize if I got that wrong, in his earlier talk today, where he was talking about be clear and be specific about your critique on something. So he had a specific example where someone says, but this interface is not intuitive. But that could mean a million different things. So be specific about what it is not intuitive. And also, you as your designer, the onus is on you to back up your thoughts and your decisions with something concrete. Yeah. And what do I mean by something concrete? So it could be either research, it could be stats, it could be usability tests that you've done, or it could even be best practice articles that are out there. The information is out there. And also always remember, as with all sort of like debates and interactions with two people, if you say no and you reject an idea, be sure to at least try to propose an alternative. And this goes for both sides. Cool. I think I'm running out of time. So let's go into the next step, which is prototype. Yeah. So in traditional design thinking, the whole idea of this phase is to produce a number of inexpensive scaled down versions of the product. It's an experimental phase, really. It's just to identify the best possible solution. So how does this apply to us? First and foremost, and like this slide and this sort of like step ties in very closely with the ideate step, where always start with the cheap version. And what do I mean about cheap version? Cheap in terms of time. So the cheapest version really is talking what's in your mind. The next cheapest version is sketching something on a piece of paper, just so you can visualize your idea and have a reference point of what you're speaking about with your developer, right? So when you talk about cheap, we're talking about low fidelity, as low as you possibly can. Please always start with that, right? I find that even like existing references of things that exist online or like apps is a good conversation starter and a good place to start when you're having these conversations. And then once you get to the expensive version, and when I mean expensive, I mean the high fidelity stuff, the Photoshop stuff, the sketch stuff. Please keep these things in mind, yeah? If possible, and if time allows, I know it's not always possible, this is a very difficult thing, please invest in a design system. This does two things for you. For you as the designer, first, it gives you like a clear boundary of where you can work. So it sort of like constrains your thinking to stop you from going absolutely wild with your ideas, right? And also for the developer, it sort of like helps eliminate inconsistencies with what they're developing. They can always have like a central source of truth and reference points to always go back to. Number two, whenever you hand over your design, please always include your states. Your different states, the different states of your buttons, different states of your cards or your links, because if you don't, you cannot complain later when you see that your hover state for your button is a red because you didn't specify it. So you can't blame your developer buddy for improvising and making up their own minds. And the third point is, if possible, also this is not very easy to do because it consumes a lot of time. If possible, rather than just a static design, try as best as possible, if you can, to provide an interactive prototype that sort of like show the different interactions, especially if your interface is very heavy on interactions and feedback. Try develop a prototype, but if you cannot develop an interactive prototype, then with the thing you can do is with your static design, you can annotate with great detail of what's supposed to happen in each step of your design. So at least when your developer sees your design, they know exactly what's happening and what needs to happen when something happens, right? Cool. And then the last phase of design thinking, we talk about testing, right? And the aim is just to rigorously test your complete product to make sure you're using the best solutions. And sometimes the results generated from this phase are used to redefine one or more steps that came previously. So maybe you might get more new ideas, or get a greater understanding of your user base. So how does this step apply to us in this dev versus design divide? So eventually, when you're designing, you are designing and building up to the point where you're going to hand over your design. But I think the key thing here is to tear down that wall between dev and design. So what you'll see today is a lovely designer will go and design great stuff and then chuck the design over the wall, never to be seen or heard of before until the stuff goes live, and then just forget about it. I think we should sort of like reframe that type of thinking, tear down that wall. Don't just throw the design over the wall, right? I think the whole idea is to have like close collaboration between these two worlds and the team in general, actually. And we find that where this exists, this type of relationship exists, the best products come out. If you can, try to be there end to end up until the product is live. Don't wait until it's too late to sort of like do your QA, your design QA. Try to maybe schedule half an hour sections in each and every day where you can sit with your developer and they can sort of like show you what they've done, so you can pick up these issues much quicker and shorten that feedback loop. And then I already talked about like pairing or desk checks. And then also one thing that always sort of like falls down by the wayside is that as designers, we use these fancy machines with like super clear displays, retina displays, like 3 times the pixels resolution that someone else has, which is great, right? Because it allows our designs to be crisp and fresh. That's great. But the problem is, once you give that designer to a developer, that developer that you're giving the design to might not have a screen which is as clear as yours. They might not have a screen which is sort of like as sharp and as advanced as yours. So what ends up happening is that the design detail that you see on your screen when you design might get lost on transition. So always make sure to test your design, not just only on your fancy screen, but on a lesser spec screen, or a screen that you expect your developer to be building this thing on. Cool. Yeah, just to sort of like re-emphasize. So we first empathize with each other, build trust. And remember, these things is a two-way street, right? It's not like we're building empathy with a developer and they're not doing it back. It should be a two-way street. We empathize with each other. We define the problem together and define how we want to work together. We sort of like ideate together and talk through the ideas together and sort of like interrogate the merits of the idea. When it gets to prototyping, make sure the prototype that you do give is clear and that you leave no room for misunderstanding, and also testing. And hopefully that will get us to a world where Ken and Ryu, developer and design, can call a truce, right? There's a great quote that I saw online. I just don't know who's it's by. It was unattributed, which says, "Without development, design is useless, and without design, development is unusable." And I mean, this quote misses a lot of nuance in the relationship between design and dev, but I think it's a great way of thinking of the importance of every single cog in the machine, sort of like summing up to a greater whole. And I'll leave you with this. You will see that underpinning all of everything that I've talked about is sort of like clear and concise communication. Always making sure that there's communication. So always remember, the communication is a culture first and tools last. So if you're in a situation where you have to choose, put the tools away and build a culture of communication. And I'll leave you with this quote from the CEO and founder of Ueno, Harald Thorelfsen. And they say, "Nothing here is someone else's problem. we pick up the trash we didn't put down. And I think that pretty much sums up that we are all in this together, and we're trying to push out the best product that we can. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can shoot in the question box, or maybe you can have a conversation. There's my email. There's my handle on the socials, Twitter, Instagram. Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you, Makaziwe. I mean, that was an awesome talk. So I've got a few questions lined up for you. But what was awesome was throughout the talk, people were also engaging with each other. You know, discussing, you know, some of the things that you I guess inspired for conversation. So let's jump on the questions. So the one with the most votes. First question is, what advice would you give for a team or that has offshore devs who can't necessarily join these requirement sessions due to time zones and other factors? And that's by Freddie.
Yeah. Sure. So yeah, that's always a problem. But I think the key thing here is getting a shared understanding of those requirements. So whether you and that person who's offshore are getting the requirements at different times, I think it's absolutely key that the two of you actually get together and discuss what the requirements are at some point, so that you have a shared understanding of what these requirements are. Because otherwise, it leaves a lot of room for misinterpretation and misunderstanding. So it's fine even if they miss the requirement sessions, but as long as at some point you two get together and actually discuss.
Okay, thank you for that. I hope that answers you, Freddie. The next one, and that's by Magdalene or Maggie from earlier. Since you've had experience being both a dev and designer, which job role did you find most challenging?
Oh, designer, without a doubt, designer, without a doubt. And I'm only saying this because I think I mentioned earlier in one of my slides is that because of what we do, whether it's a misconception or not, people like view what we do as a very visual thing, right? So even like the research and the strategy behind everything that you see that is visual is really summed up as something visual. So which means, so when it's visual, it means everyone has an opinion on what they see, right? So whether they're designer or not, everyone can just have a look and have an opinion, whether it's educated or uneducated. Everyone has an opinion, and I find that to be particularly hard. But I think that's something. I mean, that's the job we sign up for as designers. Yeah.
Okay. So the next question, Magdalene, I hope that answers. So the next question is by Samantha. What happens if you're the one stuck between the dev and design, and the design? Any advice?
So if you're the one stuck, so I'm assuming you are neither a dev or a design. So I'm just gonna make an assumption here, Samantha, that you're a BA or someone sort of like in the middle, and you are hearing these sort of like squabbles in between, right? And I think like this framework of sort of like design thinking is not just for both these two worlds. It's really for anyone. So even you who is caught in the middle, I think there's an opportunity for you to empathize with both sides, but being sure that when you empathize with both sides, it's not just on a one-to-one basis. You empathize with just this one, and then you go off and empathize with this one, which is not a bad thing. But make sure though at some point that there's communication between all three of you, right? And go through these entire steps. So and I said in the end of my talk that communication really is the cornerstone of everything that I just talked about. It's all really about communicating and speaking, and it really would do wonders. So I would say if you're caught in the middle, speak to either or, but make sure that the three of you sit in a room and actually discuss and empathize with each other and ideate together and have robust discussions and arguments and disagreements, just so you make sure you have a better product. I hope that answers you. I did take some liberties in making assumptions.
Awesome. So we've got one more question, and this is by Catherine. Which design systems can you recommend? Which works for designers and devs?
So Katrin, I'm gonna assume when you say design systems, you're talking about the collaboration tools that we use. And if that's the case, look, there's no such thing as the best tool. It's really the workman who uses the tool. But I'll tell you what I've found to be useful. So something like Zeppelin, which we use every day in the project I'm on today, works really well in that designers can upload all of their designs. They can annotate as detailed as they want. And then the developers, once they get that document, they can also get code snippets of the CSS. So it's easier for them. So I know some teams, they work without front end developers. So people might not know how to work with CSS. So something like a Zeppelin or even an Evercode, which will give you code snippets, makes it much easier for the collaboration between the two worlds. So Zeppelin, Evercode, even Abstract, which has the added advantage of having a repository. So the same way developers have a code repo in Git, is the same way that Abstract works. Yeah, hopefully I answered that question.
Yeah, I mean, Makaziwe, thank you so much for the talk, man. I think you've answered all the questions. There's been a lot of discussion in the chat. I'd suggest that you maybe go through it. But I saw there was one more question from Mike before you switch off. Mike Marie. He said, please, can you do my presentations from now on? Amazing talk. Thank you so much. Please, can you do my presentations? Yeah. So, I mean, awesome talk. Thank you so much. If anyone wants to reach out, Makaziwe is on LinkedIn and Twitter. Yeah, thank you so much. We're going to take a short break now, and then we'll be back at, I think we're back at 2. Yeah, so we're back at 2.
Cool.
So,
thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.